Accused number 10 is no more. The last surviving Rivonia trialist has departed. The one who could crack a joke and still be stern. You must remember what he attributes his long longevity to. Yes, you do. Tonight we dedicate the show to Ntate Mlangeni. Where does a life after 26 years of prison and 26 years of living under democratic state intersect? Former Presidents Thabo Mbeki and Kgalema Motlanthe join us this evening to help us answer that question. Political analyst Mlangeni will then join us a bit later on to reflect on both interviews. A lengthy intro, I must say, but definitely worth it. Good evening. I'm Aldrin Simpier, and this is African Perspective. In 2013, Mlangeni traveled to New York to participate and observe on International Nelson Mandela Day by the United Nations. He joined the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, former US President Bill Clinton, civil rights leader Reverend Jesse Jackson, among others at the event. Here's a look back at that day in July 2013.
They kept streaming in to pay homage to a world icon. The UN chief called him a giant of our times.
In the twilight of an extraordinary life, we send our prayers his way and give thanks that we have had the privilege of sharing some of his 95 years with him.
The former US president reflected on his 21-year friendship with Madiba and the lessons the 95-year-old former statesman personally taught him.
First, you can't free anybody else, and you can't serve anybody else unless first you free yourself from bitterness and hatred and resentment and the paralysis they bring. Mandela walked out of prison after 27 years, a greater man than he went in.
He says Madiba showed him that freedom was limited when other people are not also freed and empowered.
He proved you don't have to be in public office to serve the public. And that is what this day is all about. That is what the Mandela Center is all about. And though he is old and frail and fighting for his life, what is in his heart still glows in his smile and lights up the room through his eyes.
Madiba's 88-year-old comrade thanked the UN for its continued friendship with South Africa.
The United Nations has played its part in liberating the people of South Africa. Now you play an even more important role of keeping alive the values that Madiba has given us. I'm honored to be among great individuals and friends of South Africa who have joined us today. They have personally and consciously made tremendous strides in the fight against apartheid.
The UN is marking its 4th official Nelson Mandela International Day with events at missions around the world. Sherwin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Meanwhile, Africa's diplomatic capital, Addis Ababa, is also remembering anti-apartheid activist Andrew Mlangeni. Mlangeni lived in Ethiopia in 1961, where he received military training. SABC's Coletta Wanjowi looks at the role Ethiopia has played more broadly in South Africa's liberation struggle.
Andrew Mlangeni received military training here alongside the late President Nelson Mandela in the 1960s. They were trained on guerrilla warfare, how to commit acts of sabotage, military science, how to run an army and how to use a gun, among other military tactics. At that time, Ethiopia was ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie. The training of the two South African anti-apartheid campaigners paved the way for a strong bilateral relationship between Ethiopia and South Africa. In later years, While they were incarcerated, in 1963, Emperor Haile Selassie and other African leaders formed the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. The organization campaigned for the independence of South Africa and other African countries. African harbors were closed to the South African government, and South African aircrafts were prohibited from flying over the rest of the continent. Pressure was also put on the World Health Organization to remove the South African government from its membership. The independence of South Africa from apartheid rule in 1992 was considered a victory for the continent. Today, the memories of South Africa's liberation struggle remain alive in Ethiopia. When he appeared in public for the first time in 2018, after assuming power, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was wearing a T-shirt with the face of Nelson Mandela. At the African Union Commission headquarters here in Addis Ababa, the plenary hall where summits are held is named after Nelson Mandela. Coletta Wanjohi, SABC News, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Former President Thabo Mbeki has described the passing on of his Talandwe Andrew Mlangeni as more than just an end of an era. It's the passing of the last of a generation of freedom fighters who sacrificed so much for our freedom, but more importantly, who never expected or demanded any special recognition or personal benefit. President Mbeki had the pleasure of his acquaintance from the early on in his life. His father, Governor Mbeki, was Mlangeni's co-accused in the 1963 Rivonia trial alongside former President Nelson Mandela and others. To talk about his relationship with the late stalwart, we are now joined via Zoom by the former President Thabo Mbeki. Good evening and welcome to African Perspective, Mr. President. We start off the conversation by expressing our condolences to you as well as your fellow comrades.
Thanks a lot, Aldrin.
Where were you, Mr. President, when you found out about the passing on of his Talandwe, also considering that just last month we're celebrating his birthday?
Yes, no, I was here at home in Johannesburg and got the message, in fact, quite late because I was working very late into the early hours of this morning. But in any case, I got the message today while I was at home. Yeah. It's a very sad thing, but of course, bear in mind, indeed, as you have said, last month we celebrated his 95th birthday, and something that I've been dreading for some time now was exactly this news that the old man Mlangeni has left us, because he hasn't been well for quite some time. Yeah. But I got the news today at home.
Yeah. And thinking about you saying that he hasn't been well for some time, but however, though, he was one of those people who still remain committed to the cause right to the end. And earlier on this morning, I was speaking to the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, Jesse Duarte, and saying that, you know, when you look at some of the ANC celebrations, when you speak about the January 8th celebrations, he always tried to make sure that he's there and show up for the ANC.
Oh, absolutely correct. I mean, absolutely correct. No, this is a very principled member of the ANC, very committed to the perspective to serve the people of South Africa honestly. And he remained like this throughout his life and until he passed away. Mm. So indeed, you are quite correct. What Jesse Duarte said was correct. Yeah. Indeed, it reflected very much who Andrew Mlangeni was.
Yeah. Let's take a few steps back, Mr. President, probably a couple of years back, to be precise. When did you meet him, and what was that first encounter like?
Oh, this would be 60 years ago. It's 1961 in Johannesburg. We were very young people, members of the Youth League. This was an older generation, which included him, Andrew Mlangeni, people like Thomas Nkobi, like Alfred Nzo, like Dumano Okwe, like a number of others, some of them who went bad as in the course of the struggle and turned against the movement. But that whole generation, Squire Makoti, Tiza Putini. That's when I met him, and I'm saying this is a particular generation, which these are our leaders. These were our leaders, and we really looked up to them because they are the ones who got involved in the Defiance campaign, got involved in the mass struggles of the 1950s. The people who gave the strength and the popularity which the ANC enjoyed then by the early 1960s. That's how I met the old man Mlangeni, as I'm saying, was part of that particular group.
Yeah. And what is it? What was that encounter like? What is it that you took away from that, the first encounter of this person who's called Andrew Mlangeni?
Well, you are talking about 60 years ago. But as I'm saying to you, you see, the ANC had just got banned. So it was operating in those early years to say, what do we do in the circumstance that the ANC is banned is illegal? And therefore, just merely to be a member means arrest. So here, these people were saying, no, we are not intimidated. The struggle must continue. Oppression is continuing, therefore the struggle must continue. Never mind what the enemy says about the ANC, but the ANC must continue because it's got its mission. So this was the communication we had. When Nelson Mandela got arrested first time and got sentenced to 5 years, we took a decision as these very young people who were 19, 20, thereabouts. We thought that this was, we must act to get him out of jail. So we organized ourselves, put ourselves together. We even managed to get something like 6 pistols. I don't know how the message leaked to people like the late now Andrew Mlangeni and others, people like Bartholomew Tlhapane, before he turned against us, who then called us and said, look, we understand this is what you people want to do, but you must bear in mind that there might be other people who are better prepared than you are, who might be thinking in the same way, so you might get in their way. So I'm saying those are the early interventions to confirm to us that despite the fact that the ANC is illegal, you've got people like Andrew Mlangeni who are saying the struggle continues, the ANC must continue, including planning, as they told us, what they were thinking of doing to make sure that Mandela doesn't serve the sentence.
And at the time, after the 1960 Sharpeville massacre and then the launch of Umkhonto weSizwe on the 16th of December, at that time, did you understand what the purpose was behind setting up Umkhonto weSizwe? And we'll get to the part where you express your reservations around the armed struggle. But first of all, when you first encountered this idea of starting Umkhonto weSizwe, what went through your mind?
No, you see, at this time, after the banning of the ANC, we were, as I was telling you, we were members of the Youth League, ANC Youth League. So we worked among the youth. When I came to Johannesburg, we worked among the youth in what was then called the PWV region, which is Sierra, Pretoria, Vereeniging, and so on. And during that time, the youth were saying, we are no longer, we need weapons. We need to fight. So there was a very strong commitment among the generation, the constituency that we're working with, the young people, in favor of the armed struggle. And indeed, they were saying they don't want to do these other things that we wanted to do, to paint slogans on walls, to distribute leaflets and all that. They wanted arms. It's a matter that we discussed with the then Secretary General of the ANC, Tumanokwe, to say, this is what the youth are saying. So for us, the matter about the formation of Umkhonto, and therefore the decision about an armed struggle, was a view that was supported very strongly among the youth.
And from Andrew Mlangeni's end, just before he was then sent off to China for training, what was his view around that?
Well, in terms of at that point, I was telling you that we were interacting with the then Secretary General of the ANC, Tumanokwe,
Yeah.
who would absolutely insist that, you know, the ANC did not have anything to do with MK. That this is a different operation and so on. So, and the ANC had no objection. So he would tell me, to tell us about that, but it's not an ANC operation. That was the official view, and indeed that's what they communicated to us. And so I was telling you, even when we approached him, to Manokwe, to say, look, the youth are saying they want to take up arms. He would say, sure, why don't they go ahead and do that? But they can't do it via the ANC because the ANC is not involved in that. So you would not get any of those ones talking. I was staying with the Northwest.
Yes.
I knew that the ANC was very much involved because he would prepare statements of MK at home and would have to carry them in the morning to hide them and all that. So personally, I knew, but officially, in terms of our work among the youth, at that particular point, the position was that the ANC was not connected to MK.
Yeah.
So that would be the position that Andrew Mlangeni and others would have communicated to us.
Yeah. Yeah. And then at a later stage, you then change your mind and or your reservations are that armed struggle is not the way to go. Let's negotiate with the apartheid. Let's go negotiate with the apartheid state. And in the memoirs of Nelson Mandela as well, we hear that Nelson Mandela saying that when they were in Robben Island, Andrew Mlangeni was one of the first people who said that let's negotiate with the apartheid government.
No, Aldrin, you are not, the matter, you are not putting it quite correctly. The position of the ANC had been for many decades that our preference negotiated resolution of this matter. So even when the ANC said we're taking up arms to fight, that position to say that we prefer a negotiated resolution of this question was never changed. So there was the matter about a negotiated resolution and an armed struggle were not put into opposition one against the other. We took up arms because the regime would not respond positively both to the mass struggle and to the demand that let there be negotiations. So we took up arms. And once the enemy said we're ready to talk, so we, of course, we said, it's always been ANC policy that we would prefer that we talk. So when they said, because of the struggle, because of the mass pressures, they said, no, we are now ready to talk. For us, it was not an adoption of a new principle.
Yeah, yeah. And what were those negotiations like?
Well, the first thing that we did, of course, was to demand that certain conditions had to be met before negotiations could take place. For instance, the release of political prisoners and banning of organizations. Those things had to be done before what was called creating a climate conducive to negotiations.
Yes.
So those are the demands that we made. In fact, the first official interaction between the ANC in Lusaka and the government here was about that. The interactions with the government representatives in 1989 were about the release of prisoners and banning of organizations and all of that in order to create the conditions for the negotiations.
Okay, Mr. President, unfortunately, we have to go to a quick ad break. But when we come back, we want to touch then on the personal relationship that you've had with Andrew Mlangeni. We'd love to see some of your tweets as well. If you want to be part of the conversation, you can use the hashtag African Perspective. Welcome back. You're still watching African Perspective with me, Aldrin Simpier. We're reflecting on the life and legacy of Ntate Andrew Mlangeni, who has passed on at the age of 95. And we're in conversation with former President Thabo Mbeki. Former President, let's now go to the personal relationship. Starting off around about 1989, there is the release now of Andrew Mlangeni. Take us from there.
Well, so they got released indeed, as you say, in 1989. So we saw them, I saw them, and a number of us saw them, when they then came out of the country to visit our late President Oliver Tambo in Sweden. So they came, they met us in Lusaka, and I traveled with them to Europe. So that whole group, Walter Sisulu, my father, himself, Andrew, and then other, Wilson Mkwai, Ray, Msaba, and all of these others. So that's the first time that we met once they came out of jail. It was as they traveled around onto the continent and to Europe that we then had an interaction with them.
Mm-hmm. What was that experience for you like personally, on a very personal level, considering that in 1964 they are sentenced and then for up to 26 years, 27 years with former President Nelson Mandela. Now you get to encounter these people that you last had an encounter with in the early 1960s.
Well, of course, it was both a happy moment and an exciting moment. Because at last, you know, the campaign, one of the major campaigns of the global anti-apartheid movement had been the campaign for the release of political prisoners. Mm-hmm. The ANC, and in particular Oliver Tambo, had insisted on this. So to see them out of jail was a victory of that struggle, both at home and abroad, which focused on the matter of release of political prisoners. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying it was very happy occasion to see them. But of course, it also gave us an opportunity to brief them about what had been happening over the years when they were in jail and where we were with regard to a whole range of matters. Mm-hmm. I remember, for instance, when we were in Sweden, on February the 2nd, when FW de Klerk announced the unbanning of organizations and all of that, we were in Stockholm. Mm-hmm. And that particular morning, they had a meeting with the government of Sweden, and they insisted that I should stay in the hotel to hear whatever FW de Klerk would say. And I told them what de Klerk was going to say, because we had negotiated all of the matters which de Klerk announced. I knew what they were going to say and briefed them about them, but they still insisted that, no, let's hear it directly from the man, not what was promised, but to hear it directly. So, I mean, they were very focused on this because of the focus on the continuation of the struggle.
Yeah. And then the tough work then starts, because now we are speaking about an organization that has been banned before but now is unbanned, and that organization is now leading into a democratic dispensation leading up to the 1994 elections. But within the ANC itself, there are negotiations within the ANC around who would be part of the leadership that would lead us to 1994. Can you quickly just take us into your confidence with regards to the conversations that were taking place there, and what were Ntate Andrew Mlangeni's take on that as well?
Well, I don't know. I don't think there was that much discussion about who was going to lead. I mean, we all agreed, for instance, that Nelson Mandela would take over as president, that Oliver Tambo would be national chairperson. Mm-hmm. And then this is in preparation to the national conference which took place in '91 in Devon.
Yeah.
So and the rest, I was not involved in any wide-ranging discussion about this matter, because normally you would not do that in terms of preparing. It came later, this business of slates and so on. It wasn't there then. But obviously Andrew Mlangeni, my father, Walter Sisulu, and all of these others would have had their own discussion on their own about these particular matters, not necessarily involving the rest of us. One of the things that happened at the conference was that the ANC had 14 regions at the time. I had been nominated by 7 of these regions for the position of deputy president. I was then called in by Joe Mudise, who said to me that, look, you've been nominated. Chris Hani would be nominated from the floor. And we don't want this contest between the two of you. And therefore, you must decline the nomination. Chris will decline the nomination, and we will get the old man Sisulu to stand for this position. So he was telling me this thing. So I said, fine, agreed. So that's a discussion that would have taken place somewhere else, which would have included Andrew Mlangeni and the others. That this was their position. They just communicated to us, and when we acted as they said.
Yes. So then the negotiation or the discussions that would have taken place, which you probably say that you were not privy to, how then does Thabo Mbeki then become deputy president of the ANC and later on deputy president of the country as well, considering that you're also serving under the leadership of somebody who was also part of the Rivonia trial, former President Nelson Mandela?
Well, I mean, there were no conspiracies about these leadership matters. What happened is that, indeed, in Durban, Oliver Tambo was elected the national chairperson of the organization. And then he passed away in 1993. And the ANC conference was next conference was in 1994. So at that conference was then decided that if I should take over the position which had been vacated by OR because he passed away, this one of chairpersonship of the ANC. So there was no conspiracy about it, but I don't know how the feeling developed within the organization that the best person to succeed or would be this one in this particular position.
And so the question that we asked earlier on is 26 years of spending life in prison, and there's one clip where Andrew Mlangeni says that he was quite shocked to see that things were still the same. This is now after leaving prison in 1989, and then we speak of 26 years living under a democratic state. What would you say, what type of political party is it that Andrew Mlangeni leaves behind?
Well, I think clearly the ANC is facing many challenges. You could recall, Aldrin, that at the last national conference of the ANC, which is December 2017, one of the decisions that was taken by the ANC was that it needs to go through a process of renewal. That was a very good and a very correct decision. And a very good and correct decision. Yes, I can. I'm saying it was a very good and correct decision. Because indeed, the Andrew Mlangeni's organization, the ANC, does need that renewal in terms of ensuring that its membership is truly ANC in terms of its values, in terms of the policies that it pursues, in terms of a commitment to serve the people of South Africa. It needs to attend to all of those things. So that process of renewal is important. And therefore, I'm saying this ANC of Andrew Mlangeni needs to go through that process so that then Andrew Mlangeni would then have said, this is the ANC that we developed.
Yeah. Would you say that that process of renewal has yielded any results from where you're sitting at the moment?
Well, from my point of my perspective, earlier this year, I went to KZN at the invitation of the provincial leadership of the ANC. And the provincial leadership of the ANC said to me, there is this challenge that was put out by conference of this renewal. Now, can you please come and join us so that we discuss this matter as to how do we do it? So we sat there for 2 days, the whole provincial executive committee, representatives from the regional committees, members of the legislatures. It was a very broad cross-section of the ANC leadership in the province to discuss that matter of renewal. Mm-hmm. And indeed, once that got known by the other ANC provinces, they then asked that I should also do the same thing with them. Mm-hmm. So we were beginning that process to attend to what had been decided at the conference in December 2017 of the renewal.
Yes.
To say, by when we say renewal, what do we mean? What should happen practically? Mm-hmm. What kind of ANC in the end do we want to emerge out of that process of renewal? I'm saying that the other provinces had also said we would then have to go around the other provinces for that purpose. Mm. Our work, of course, got disrupted by the COVID-19 issue, but that program, in principle, still remains.
Yeah, but my question is in terms of the results itself, from where you're sitting, from your own perspective, do you think that that process of renewal has resulted in any good results?
No, I was giving an example of part of what we've done, which got disrupted because of the COVID-19 issue. Mm-hmm. But no, the process, the kind of process I've been describing has not happened yet.
Yeah.
Of the kind of interaction with the leadership at those provincial and regional levels, so that we can get out to the membership of the ANC, so that that membership gets involved in the process of renewal.
Sure.
No, that process had just started.
Yeah.
Certainly from my perspective. So no, we're still very far from getting through with it.
Okay, and in a short while we will be joined by former President Kgalema Motlanthe also to reflect on the life and the legacy of Ntate Mlangeni. As you can see that he's sitting by there for this conversation that we'll be having. But Mr. President, Thabo Mbeki, in conclusion, the discussion around the land issue, which is something that I'll touch as well with former President Kgalema Motlanthe, who touched on it yesterday as well. How do we address the land issue? And I know the last time I spoke to you, you said that there seems to be this misconception where people are not focusing on land hunger in urban areas.
So absolutely. I mean, there's a very pressing problem about land for settlement, for accommodation, for housing in the urban areas that needs to be addressed, obviously. In the context also of this transformation of the apartheid spatial arrangements. We need to reconstruct our urban areas so that they are not segregated in an apartheid way as they are now. But I've been saying with regard to the land question, the correct position for the ANC is the position that's stated in the Freedom Charter, which says the land shall be shared among those who work it. I think that remains the correct position that we should maintain and do whatever is necessary to be done in order to achieve that objective. Mm-hmm. So I think that needs to be central in terms of the pursuit of the land issue.
Yeah. How is the 2017 resolution a departure from that, if at all?
Well, when we've discussed the matter with the leadership of the ANC, they don't disagree with what the Freedom Charter says. And so even as it ANC has discussed this matter, that when you talk about the amendment of the particular clause in the Constitution, the property clause, it is to clarify what indeed should happen, under what circumstances would this expropriation without compensation take place, which is a perfectly legitimate proposition to make. But the ANC is saying, but we must define under what circumstances that takes place. Mm-hmm. And they took an important decision at the 2017 conference that this process, very necessary process, making sure that the land is shared by all who work it, must also take into account that we don't create a crisis with regard to food production, the economy, and all that. Those were correct positions. So I think that so long as we remain with this broad strategic view, as I say, which was stated in the Freedom Charter, which the ANC speaks about every day, I think so long as we stick with that and actually do something to make sure that the land is shared out in that way, then I think we'll be in the right direction.
Yeah, and also just in closing, considering that Mlangeni himself was, his family was evicted from a farm, I wonder that, when he departs, when he departed at the age of 95, when he reflects back and look at what the movement was standing for and what the movement was about, is he at all proud of the land issue and how the ANC has handled the land issue? And I'd like to hear your view on that.
In Aldrin, we are facing many challenges in the country. You see, I don't want to, the agriculture, let's just talk agriculture. Agriculture in South Africa accounts for 3 or 4% of the wealth of the country. The wealth of this country is very unevenly distributed. The inequality that people are talking about, very, very correct, is very, very bad. And indeed, the allegation is made that levels of inequality in South Africa are #1 in the world. That's a matter we must address. The land question is part of that.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should just focus on the land and leave all else. The process of radical transformation of South African society must take into account all of those things.
Yeah.
The land and everything else. So that certainly would be what Andrew Mlangeni would be saying.
Okay. Thank you so much, former President Thabo Mbeki, reflecting on the life, the legacy of Tate Mlangeni, but also the type of country that he leaves behind and the type of organization that he leaves behind. When we come back, we'll be in conversation with former President Kgalema Motlanthe. Well, former President Kgalema Motlanthe was imprisoned in Robben Island as a political prisoner, as was stalwart Andrew Mlangeni. Motlanthe, who also served as the ANC's deputy president, now joins us to share his memories of their relationship, which dates back to years behind bars. Mr. President, good evening and welcome to African Perspective. Take us back to those days.
Good evening and good evening to your viewers. Well, you know, we were, as you know, the Rivonia trialists were kept in a single cell section, and we were in the communal cell sections, in the general sections. But from time to time, we were able to meet and also to exchange notes. Because, you know, the organization was established and it has its structures. So that's how, you know, prison life was. In certain periods, a head of prison will come and divide the sections with, you know, the construction of perimeter walls which separate the sections. Whereas in the early days, it was only, you know, wire gauze that separated the sections, yes.
Yeah. Earlier on last week, as we were mourning the death of a former ambassador, Zinzi Mandela, the visual that kept on coming out is, of course, the moment where she reads this letter that comes from her father. Can you tell us, perhaps, what the conversations were like behind bars? And even though some of you weren't able to interact, for those who were able to interact, what were those conversations like?
Well, firstly, the offer was made to the Rivonia tribes, the leadership, that is, that they would be released if they renounced violence. And once they took a stand, and of course, all this was shared throughout the structures of the organization behind bars. And so the stand they took was a stand to be followed by all of us. So once the authorities realized that failed with them, they then extended the same offer to all other political prisoners. But that also elicited the same response.
Let's then fast forward to 1989 again with the release of Ndate Andrew Mlangeni. And I don't know, post 1989, when was your first interaction with him and what was that conversation about?
Well, you know, after their release, you know, within a matter of months, the organization was unbanned. And therefore, the immediate task was to establish legal structures of the organization. And I had, you know, been serving as a support, you know, to what was known as the internal leadership corps chaired by Tate Sulu. And so when the task of demarcating the country into regions and establishing structures, interim structures that were to embark on the process of establishing legal structures of the ANC, I was then assigned to be the coordinator, which meant chair of the structures, interim structure in the PWV then, which is Gauteng province. And the guidelines were that I should at least establish a committee made up of 15 other comrades, and that's how we were able to embark on the process of establishing these legal structures. So Tate Mlangeni, as someone who's from Soweto, was key in the establishment of the branch of the ANC in Dube village. He still he he passed on living there still in the same house that he occupied even before going to prison. Yes.
And
so we interacted a lot at that time, and that all of them, I mean, Tate Mtoledi, Tate Sisulu, Tate Mkwai, Wilton Mkwai, were all part of the organizing department at HQ. And Tate Mlangeni was then made in charge of transport, in other words, the fleet of the ANC.
I actually saw an interview on another channel, Mr. President, that you had earlier on today, and the question around the transport also came up, and how, for instance, there were issues around his calculations.
Well, no, not really his calculations, but, in terms of what the rand could buy. And so, he would give the driver 40 rand and says, fill up a tank. And when comrades were coming through from other provinces, flying into the airport, they would be picked up. And he was responsible and in charge of those arrangements.
Yeah.
And so many a times, comrades who were driving these cars of the ANC would run out of fuel along the freeway, either to the air or from the air. and he had difficulties in coming to terms with what 40 rand could purchase in terms of fuel.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, he was persuaded to understand that the buying power of the rand was not as strong as it used to be.
Okay, then let's move on to his hopes and aspirations for the people that he lived around in Dube, for instance, and knowing very well that while the ANC still has its shortcomings, and the ANC, some may argue, has not lived up to its ideals and the vision of its founding fathers, what was it about his commitment to the party?
I've lost you've lost your audio, you are muted.
Okay, let's repeat that question. It's around his commitment for the party or to the party, even though he himself would highlight some of the issues that the party is facing and how the party is failing to live up to the visions as well as the ideals of its founding fathers.
Well, he was a very loyal member of the African National Congress, and he's committed never ever waned at any given time. And he was there not just on the sidelines. When the time for Parliament arrived, he was one of those who served in that National Assembly until much later in 2015, actually.
What did he tell you about the state of the party? What conversations did you have about the state of the party, and also considering that he was appointed the chairperson of the Integrity Commission?
Well, it always worried him and disappointed him whenever ANC comrades who are given responsibility in of public office were found to either being in the wrong and or acting in a manner that is unethical. It always pains, and he never moved his way to whenever he felt that someone had to be called out for wrongdoing.
Yeah, and his link to that lack of capacity from the ANC side, and what impact that has on the governance of the country. And taking into consideration the conversation that you had yesterday, the foundation had yesterday, about the socio-economic conditions that South Africans find themselves in 26 years into democracy.
Well, the progress. Remember that Mlangeni belongs to a generation who essentially crafted the Freedom Charter as, a document enshrining the aspirations of South Africans and also, in a sense, laying down the foundation for a future free, democratic South Africa. So his assessment of the progress that was achieved was also tempered by the expectations they had in terms of, what a free South Africa would look like. And so there are areas that truly pleased him, and there are areas that disappointed him deeply.
Yeah. Would one of those areas of disappointment also be the land question?
Yes, of course. The land question, in terms of how it manifests itself, the urban areas and manifests itself by lack of accommodation, not within rental stocks these days, and so people end up in squalid, petty conditions in informal settlements.
Yeah.
And that was a source of disappointment. And so the land question has to be addressed, firstly, around urban areas where the problem is most acute in terms of just accommodation. And then there's the plight of farm dwellers. Now, Mlangeni comes from a family of farm dwellers.
Yeah.
Even though at a certain point when he was still young, they moved out of the farm. And so the plight of farm dwellers and the plight of our rural community in what was designed as reserves and later as homelands, that's really of concern, because people were communities were literally uprooted from fertile lands where, they were able to till and harvest very richly, to semi-barren areas away from sources of water and so on. And so there's a lot of injustice, and this is recognized by the Constitution of the Republic.
Yeah. Actually, there's one lecture where Dr. Lushaba reflects on what's called the citizen as well as the subject, and he argues that with looking at how even the government has responded, the democratic state now has responded to the plight of people on farmlands as well as people on traditional land as well, it would almost seem that they still remain subjects, because there are subjects that don't own land. And one of the examples, for instance, would be the Kgalema Trust. And how do you answer that question, or how you deal with that particular debacle?
Yeah. Once again, you were muted. Your last word, I heard the first part of what you were saying.
Sure.
But,
so the example that I'm giving is around the Kgalema Trust, for instance, and how some people who live on that land don't feel any affiliation to the land because they don't necessarily own the land.
Well, there are different forms of ownership of land. There's ownership which is based on the principle of usufruct, and there is ownership which is based on holding title. because title is also a commercial instrument. Now, the Ngonyama Trust Act was passed in order to preserve the land which was, KwaZulu homeland, and hence the Ngonyama Isilo is the sole trustee according to that act. Mm-hmm. But there's a board which manages the affairs of the Ngonyama Trust. And when we served in the high-level panel established by the Speakers Forum in Parliament, we had occasion to listen to people who felt that the manner in which the board of the Ngonyama Trust was, compelling them to sign up lease agreement was an injustice. Mm-hmm. And so in the final report we made recommendations that Ngonyama Trust Act should either be repealed or amended to bring it in line with the Constitution of the Republic.
And Mr. President, what do you make then of the inaction of politicians, parliamentarians around this particular question that you have raised? Because there was another report as well that came out later on, also looking at the land question and also the Ngonyama Trust, that said and recommended that the act be repealed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Once again, you tell and your voice.
You're losing
disappear.
Me. Yes. Okay, let me try again then. So there is the recommendation that came from the panel that you were chairing, and then there was another recommendation that came from another panel that was looking into the land question. And both these panels agreed that the Ngonyama Trust Act should be repealed. So my question then is to you that what do you make of the lack of action from parliamentarians or even politicians or even the ANC for that matter to deal with this particular aspect that has been raised by these two panels?
Well, this is really an aspect of a larger question of how we deal with the land. Remember, the land question deals with land redistribution, land reform, and land restitution and security of tenure. These are the four aspects of the land reform in its entirety, and so the Ngonyama Trust Act is but an aspect of this larger question, and so the legislators, parliamentarians, are slack in dealing with the totality of these issues, and so it's not a question of the one being more urgent than the other. Yeah. They ought to be addressed in a wholesome fashion, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. That is the former President Kgalema Motlanthe, again reflecting on the life, the legacy of Ndate Andrew Mlangeni, but also the country that he leaves behind as well as the organization that he leaves behind. When we come back, we'll be in conversation with Lukhona Mnguni and we'll be reflecting on both the interviews. We'd love to hear your take as well. You can tweet, use the hashtag African Perspective. Let's hear your take as well. And welcome back. We're now joined by political analyst Lukona Mnguni to reflect on the conversations that we just had with former President Thabo Mbeki as well as former President Kgalema Motlanthe on the life, the legacy of Ntate Andrew Mlangeni, but also, as I said earlier, on the country that he leaves behind as well as the organization that he leaves behind. Lukona, good evening and welcome to African Perspective. Let's first start off with your take on both interviews.
Well, good evening, Aldrin. I think at this moment it's important to say both interviews showcase the life and legacy of Utatomkhulu to me, because he's part of the generation of my grandparents, Utatomkhulu Andrew Mlangeni, and how he dedicated himself to the question of struggle, to the question of social justice, and really how he epitomized what many comrades like calling revolutionary morality. People who are concerned about the means and the ends, that dialectical conversation in terms of how do you ensure that your means of struggle are within also the frame of the ends that you are looking for, so that your actions are just and the outcomes of your actions are also just. And I think it really reflects the dedication also that Utatomkhulu Andrew Mlangeni came out with from prison and still became a lively part of the South African life until his last days in life. He was very strong for a 95-year-old, and he stood up at times when it mattered the most, Aldrin, when there was a drift in his organization. He wasn't scared. Of course, I think with the high moral structure that he had and with the moral force that he could, of course, stand up to malfeasance. He could stand up to poor leadership. And I think that's why at some point he and his Integrity Commission in 2016, they even stood up to the then president to ask him to step down because they felt he wasn't leading the organization in a manner that it was expected. And that was an important statement for him and his Integrity Commission to make, because they were appointed by that very same leadership in 2012. And therefore, he was standing up to the very leadership that had ensured that he chairs the Integrity Commission. And that, for me, I read it as him saying he's not willing to be used as a token to whitewash the sins of the ANC and become the face of it, but he is willing to effectively fight for the ANC to move away from its path that it was drifting towards, which was devoid of this revolutionary morality I speak of.
And actually that particular moment that you now raise around the Integrity Commission and the call for former President Jacob Zuma to step down, even during that moment, there were these contradictory versions that were coming up. At some point, I even remember one of the leaderships of the ANC saying that the authenticity of the letter that has been sent is being brought into question.
No, of course, denialism, Aldrin, is also a weapon that people use, particularly when they are trying to hide their own shortcomings and they are trying to allow wrongs and wrongdoing to continue to manifest in the body politic, simply because that wrongdoing accrues certain value and accrues certain benefit for them. Of course, you wouldn't then want that kind of status quo to go away. But we do know that there were a series of meetings that happened. They requested a meeting with the then Secretary General, and he himself came out to the media and said, at the end of the day, as the Integrity Commission, all that we can do is to recommend. It is then up to the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress to then take decisions on our recommendations. And if the NEC politically is married to the wrongdoing, is married to the wrong drift of the organization in its overwhelming majority, then of course the recommendations of the Integrity Commission would then be ignored and parked aside and not attended to, which of course then rendered that structure to something that was reflected on as being a toothless body that can't really force the hand of the politicians if the politicians themselves close ranks and then protect each other.
Yeah. So in the statement that was released by the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, it highlights that Mlangeni came from a farm laborer family who were evicted while he was of a tender age. And for me, this part has been very important in both conversations with former President Thabo Mbeki as well as former President Kgalema Motlanthe. What do you make of the handling of that question from both of them around the land debate?
Well, perhaps, Aldrin, let's first deal with it from Tatomkhulu Mlangeni's perspective that, in fact, in 2017, June, he and his family went back to search for his father's grave in that farm, somewhere around then Kwakwa, today's Puta Dichaba. And the story goes that as they were about to give up, and I think this is a story written by Lidwaba in the Mail and Guardian, then as they were about to give up, somebody then stumbled on a grave that had been, covered by grass, and it was the grave of Tatomkhulu Mlangeni's father. And he himself, Mlangeni, had last been at that farm in the 1950s when they were there to do some traditional rituals. And so there was that sort of a full circle. They were a product of that farm land tenure system, so where you traded your labor for some level of security of tenure in that particular farm. And so in 2017, he agonized a lot on this land question himself because of that particular personal history. And he did admit that the ANC had, in fact, not done so well in addressing the land question in government. And because of that, he did support the proposals for land expropriation without compensation. He did, of course, sort of disagreed with organizations such as the EFF that were promoting land occupation and so on. But to come back to your question, I think, of course, both the presidents you've spoken to might differ a bit in this sense. Former President Thabo Mbeki had the opportunity, incumbent in office for 10 years as president, 5 years as deputy president, to really try and oversee how government deals with this question of the land. And in one of the interviews, he has, to an extent, sort of accepted that they might not have placed enough seriousness and detailed attention on this question of the land. And therefore, there were some missed opportunities. I mean, if you look at the processes of claims, the backlog in terms of the restitution claims that are there, the inappropriate measures that were put around redistribution in some cases, the inadequacy of the land tenure system in terms of the Security of Tenure Act, trying to get people in farms to be land secure. We didn't see much movement. People got evicted in droves and were quite vulnerable. President Kgalema Motlanthe, on the other hand, has had the privilege, I think, to chair that high-level panel, and that report they produced with his fellow panelists goes at length in terms of addressing the question of land, particularly what they termed in that report structural vulnerability of people who are in rural areas, and the manner in which legislation has not been adequately put up to ensure security of tenure, even of people who are already in rural areas in communal land, but they do not have full rights over that land. And therefore, there must be some process to try and transfer land rights to communities. And then you have to work out the modalities of the system that you will use. So I think both are reflecting a serious shortcoming on the question of land. I do know that the question of urban land poverty is a very important question, and President Thabo Mbeki is extremely passionate about it. And we've seen it with coronavirus. If you look to Western Cape, especially in Cape Town, with the land invasions and the land evictions, Aldrin, that land, the urban land question, needs to be seriously addressed, particularly for issues of residential land.
Is the current process that is underway, because former President Kgalema Motlanthe speaks about the processes that are underway encompassing everything, that you can't just deal with issues on a piece-by-piece basis, but bring them all together and discuss everything. Is the current committee that has been set up to look into amending Section 25 of the Constitution a committee that can actually deal with those particular questions, whether it is urban land or whether it is communal land? Really?
Aldrin, the problem with the current process is that it is a process for land acquisition. So the concept of land expropriation without compensation means that you are acquiring the land. Now, what then follows when you've acquired the land?
Yes.
And that is going to be phase 2 of the conversation, and it is not going to be addressed by amending Section 25. What you need is a uniform legislative framework that allows you to acquire the land and then distribute it to people, but offer them rights over the land so that they have security, and offer them rights that will effectively give them governance over that land that you would have given to them. Then deal, of course, because there are two separate issues in the instance that you still have to restitute land back to certain families. You still have to redistribute land so that you have a much more equitable ownership of land across the country that reflects the demographics of the country. And then you also have to make sure that you guarantee security of tenure for the people whose families, for example, I have an aunt who has grown up all her life in a farm, and she worked in a farm. Her kids worked in the farm. Some of her grandkids work on that farm today. But her situation is so precarious because the farmer can decide to evict them, and effectively they have not been given security of tenure there. So you've got to sort out these things. They manifest differently because of the historical trajectory that gave birth to them. But what is needed is a broad, uniform legislative framework that deals beyond the question of acquisition. So the amendment of Section 25 is a land acquisition framework, rather than then giving rights over that land once it has been acquired to the people. We can talk on another day about what the wording of that proposed bill, which I think it's a very minimalistic bill. It doesn't go far enough. For example, it still doesn't call for the removal of the subsection under Section 25 that deals with the cut-off for land for land claim being 1913, and you've got to remove that 1913 from Section 25 so that you allow people who can prove that their land was dispossessed much before 1913. If you read Tembeka Ngqaitobi's book, The Land is Ours, he demonstrates that some parts of the Eastern Cape, as far back as the mid-1800s, they were beginning to lose land. But the legislative framework, even the Constitution, shuts out those areas from being part of the conversation on land restitution. And we've got to open it up in a much more expansive way if we want to make sure that the land question is addressed and probably put to finality for generations to come.
In conclusion, what do you make of the type of ANC that the Andrew Mlangeni is leaving behind?
He leaves behind a duplicitous ANC that has no center that is holding in terms of its moral compass. He leaves behind an ANC of a weak cadre. You'll remember that when the Integrity Commission was appointed after the Mangaung Conference in 2012, that conference also launched the Decade of the Cadre, which is meant to come to an end in 2022. Very little to show that the Decade of the Cadre has in actual fact groomed a new core of cadres in the ANC. He leaves behind an ANC that some of its leaders are not afraid to steal, even in the time of a global pandemic such as the coronavirus crisis. He leaves behind an ANC that attempts to do soul searching but falls short to do so because of the sins of incumbency and the enjoyment of value that accrues from political office. He definitely leaves behind an ANC that no longer carries that discipline, that intellectual commitment, that moral rectitude, and that type of selflessness that his generation embodied, that his generation could reimagine even a new repertoire of struggle for the ANC and bring it to fruition. So he leaves behind an ANC that is probably at a polar opposite of the ANC of his generation. And I think probably as he rests easily, we hope that his soul might look and watch over us and be a guiding light as South Africa, and as we try to contend with the repercussions of the leadership of the ANC that he leaves behind today.
A yes or no question from what former President Thabo Mbeki said about the renewal of the ANC. Do you feel, or did you get a sense that that renewal has been stalled?
No, renewal is a process, Aldrin. As he said, they were just beginning to open the box to check whether it's a Pandora's box or what kind of a box. They still haven't done enough to even open the box and understand what kind of journey they have to travel in renewing the ANC. And unfortunately, as he says, coronavirus intervened after his journey to KwaZulu-Natal. Yeah. Therefore, after this period, the ANC will still have much more to do. And I think this period has also compromised them a lot in terms of their own conduct and the conduct of some of their leaders. So the work they have to do is actually much bigger than it was 3-4 months ago.
Mlangeni, thank you so much for your time. We've come to the end of this special edition of African Perspective as we reflected on the life and the legacy of Ntate Andrew Mlangeni. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye from me, Aldrin Sempier, as well as the entire team. To the team of The Globe, we'd like to say thank you so much. But we end off tonight's show with this package.
The home of the late struggle veteran Andrew Mlangeni. This is where he spent the last years of his life among the ordinary people of Soweto. The 95-year-old struggle icon is remembered, among other things, for his jovial mood, making everyone around him feel special in many ways. Mlangeni, who passed away on Tuesday night, was admitted to one military hospital in Pretoria after complaining of an abdominal ailment.
He was a very strong man. He was very strong. And, and with a very good memory for his age. Like the other day he was saying to me, hey, I wish I was young, I was about 30 years of age with the experience that I have so that we can go and play golf, shaking his body like this. I feel like we could go and play golf because he was very passionate about golf.
Mlangeni spent over 20 years on Robben Island after his conviction at the apartheid-era treason trial in 1964. He was among other fellow freedom fighters, Dada Nelson Mandela, Dennis Goldberg, Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada and many others. And for the community of Soweto, he leaves them with heavy hearts.
Just recently, he was celebrating his birthday. To our surprise, we were called to the street not many days thereafter to come and collect some vegetables. He was such a caring someone.
All that I've learned from Tate Mlangeni is that he's not corrupt. And he was anti-corrupt officials of the ANC. He was a man of integrity.
Some have fond memories of Ntate Mlangeni.
There's just a number of things that he said, which I'm not going to say now, so they were a bit embarrassing for me because I'm still a minor, and I still have that particular respect for him.
Those short jokes that you'd get, the same, I think it was the 26th of December, actually came to just see him and spend a day with him. The next thing we were busy fixing stuff because he had to prepare his minutes.
Dada Andrew Mlangeni lives behind his children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Meanwhile, funeral arrangements of the late former Rivonia trialist are yet to be confirmed. Abongile Dumako, SABC News, Johannesburg.